There's a whole genre of video going viral right now claiming that scientists found something in America they were never supposed to make public. The truth is stranger than the cover-up story, because the people who supposedly buried the discovery are the same scientists who spent 30 years digging it up. The textbook version of who first reached this continent, the entire question of the peopling of the Americas, really was wrong. It really has been overturned. But almost everything about how that happened, in the videos racking up millions of views, is backwards. So let's do the thing those videos never do. Let's sort what's real from what's hype, rank the evidence honestly, and end on the part they always skip. The answer. Start with the story you were taught in school. For most of the 20th century, the first Americans had a name, the Clovis people, after a site in New Mexico where distinctive fluted spear points turned up. The story was tidy. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters walked across a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, slipped south through a gap between two great ice sheets, the so-called ice-free corridor, and spread across the continent. They were first. Everyone else came later. That idea was so dominant, it had a nickname among the archaeologists who dared to question it. They called the defenders the Clovis Police. Here's the first thing the viral videos get right. That story is dead. But it wasn't killed by a single buried secret. It was killed slowly, by site after site, over decades, in plain sight. And when you line those sites up by how good the evidence actually is, you get a much clearer picture than any rage-bait thumbnail will give you. Start with the strongest, because it's genuinely extraordinary. White Sands, New Mexico. In the gypsum flats of an ancient dried lake bed, researchers found fossilized human footprints. Not one or two, but thousands, including the small prints of children, pressed into mud alongside the tracks of mammoths and giant ground sloths. When the prints were first dated to between 21 and 23,000 years ago, the field erupted. Because that's not a little older than Clovis, that's roughly 10,000 years older, deep into the coldest part of the last ice age. Critics pushed back hard, arguing the seeds used to date the prints might have absorbed ancient carbon from the water and looked older than they really were. It was a fair objection, so the team went back and tested again, twice. They dated tree pollen, which doesn't have that problem. Then they dated the lakebed mud itself, using two independent laboratories. Every method landed in the same window. Today there are 55 separate dated samples across 3 different materials, all pointing to the same answer. As one of the lead researchers put it, you reach a point where it gets really hard to explain all of this away. White Sands is the Keystone. If you remember one site, remember that one. Now travel to the other end of the hemisphere, to Monte Verde in southern Chile. This is the site the viral videos barely mention, and that's a tell, because Monte Verde is the one that actually broke the Clovis consensus. A waterlogged bog there preserved wooden tools, hearths, even chewed plants, dating to around 14,500 years ago. Though it's worth noting that a 2026 study by Cerutti and colleagues has raised fresh questions about those dates, and the debate is ongoing. In 1997, a team of senior archaeologists, including some hardened skeptics, visited the site in person to scrutinize it, and came away convinced. That visit is widely considered the moment Clovis first began to fall apart inside mainstream science. Not a leak, not a cover-up, a field trip. Next, back to Oregon, to the Paisley Caves. What researchers pulled out of the dirt here wasn't a tool or a weapon. It was human waste, dried, hardened, and preserved for thousands of years in the desert air. And inside that ancient material was something stone could never offer: human DNA. Specifically, mitochondrial haplogroups A and B, 2 of the founding lineages, haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, that define the genetic ancestry of Native Americans and represent the direct maternal ancestors of indigenous peoples living today. The dates ran past 14,000 years. There were contamination questions, as there always are, and they were largely worked through. This isn't a vanished mystery, people. These are somebody's ancestors. And the stone tools found alongside them belong to what researchers call the Western stemmed tradition, a distinct technological lineage that predates or runs parallel to Clovis, and suggests multiple cultural streams entering the continent, not just one. So far, so solid. Now we get into the territory where you have to be more careful, and where being honest is exactly what separates a good account from a clickbait one. Meadowcroft Rockshelter in western Pennsylvania was actually the first crack of all, decades before the rest. An archaeologist named James Adavasio dug down through its floor starting in 1973 and pulled 52 radiocarbon dates that lined up in near-perfect order, with the oldest reaching back around 16,000 years. That should have ended the debate. It didn't. and the reasons are legitimate. Critics pointed out the site sits near coal-bearing rock, and worried that ancient carbon could have leached in and made the dates look too old. They also noted the near absence of Ice Age plants and animals you'd expect from a site that old. Adavasio has spent decades rebutting both objections, and later sediment studies backed him up. But notice what that argument actually is. It's not suppression. It's scientists demanding that an extraordinary claim survive every ordinary explanation first. That's the system working. Over in Texas, the story gets more crowded. In the best way. At the Buttermilk Creek complex, also called the Friedkin site, archaeologists found stone tools buried beneath a Clovis layer and dated them to around 15,500 years ago. These aren't marginal finds. There are roughly 16,000 artifacts. The site, excavated by archaeologist Michael Waters and his team, shows that people were already experimenting with tool technology in central Texas before the Clovis tradition even existed. It fills a gap the script of Clovis First could never quite paper over. A substantial, well-excavated, continental interior site that puts pre-Clovis people squarely in North America. Which brings us to Rimrock Draw in the Oregon desert, and to a number you may have seen quoted wrong. Here a team found a beautiful orange agate tool, a scraper with bison blood still on its edge, buried beneath a layer of volcanic ash from an eruption of Mount St. Helens. Ash layers are gifts to archaeologists, because they're natural clocks. Anything below the ash is older than the eruption. Beneath that ash, tooth enamel from an extinct camel was radiocarbon dated, and here's the real figure: 18,250 years. You'll see videos claim this site is 21 or 22,000 years old. It isn't. That's an inflation of about 3,000 years. And it matters because once a channel starts padding numbers to make a thumbnail hit harder, you can't trust any figure it gives you. The real number is astonishing enough. It doesn't need the help. And now the site every cover-up video is really built around: the Cerutti Mastodon near San Diego. In 2017, in the journal Nature, a team claimed that mastodon bones found during a 1990s highway dig showed signs of being smashed open by humans, and dated them, using uranium in the bone, to around 130,000 years ago. Read that again. Not 14,000, 130,000. If that were true, it would place some kind of human in California before our own species had even left Africa. The viral videos frame the silence around Cerutti as fear, scientists too scared to touch it. The reality is much less cinematic. The site was found by heavy construction equipment, and multiple researchers have shown that the bone breakage and the so-called hammerstones are exactly what you'd expect from a backhoe and a grader rolling through a fossil bed. A follow-up study found the broken bones weren't meaningfully different from ordinary mastodon sites where no humans were involved. There are no stone tools. There are no cut marks. There's no hearth, no charcoal, nothing else human at all. And the claim asks you to multiply the known human history of the Americas by a factor of nearly 10, on the strength of some cracked bone and 5 rocks. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and most archaeologists simply judged that the simpler explanation, a construction accident, was far more likely. That's not a conspiracy. That's a coin that hasn't landed. So here's where the Honest Scorecard leaves us. Humans were at White Sands more than 20,000 years ago. That's about as solid as this field gets. Multiple sites, White Sands, Paisley Caves, Buttermilk Creek, Meadowcroft, and others, put people across both American continents well before Clovis. And the wildest claim, the 130,000-year one, is almost certainly a mirage. The first Americans came earlier than your textbook said. They did not come 100,000 years early. Which leaves the biggest question of all, and it's the one those videos almost never actually answer. If Clovis wasn't first, and people were here during the Ice Age, how did they even get in? This is where the real discovery lives, and it's better than any cover-up. Remember that ice-free corridor? The gap between the glaciers that the old textbook used as the highway into America? In 2016, Pedersen and colleagues published a landmark study in Nature in which scientists drilled into the beds of lakes that once sat right in the middle of that corridor and pulled out ancient DNA to reconstruct, century by century, when life returned to it. The answer was devastating for the old model. The corridor didn't become survivable, didn't have the plants, the animals, the food a traveler would need, until about 12,600 years ago. But Clovis people were already living south of the ice by 13,500 years ago. And Monte Verde, whatever the final verdict on its dates turns out to be, sits far to the south and far earlier. The only door the textbook ever offered opened too late. People were already inside, so they must have come another way. And the leading answer is the coast. Picture it. Not hunters trudging through a frozen inland gap, but small groups in boats moving down the Pacific shoreline, hugging the edge of the continent. Researcher John Erlandson has been one of the most influential voices arguing for what scientists call the Kelp Highway, the idea that the coastline of the North Pacific was lined with kelp forests, and kelp forests are among the richest food sources on Earth, packed with fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds. A coastal people could have moved from one camp to the next, following the tides, possibly even crossing stretches of winter sea ice, all the way from Northeast Asia down into the Americas, generations before the inland corridor was ever passable. And one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for that coastal route sits at Cooper's Ferry, Idaho. Dated to around 15,800 years ago, older than the ice-free corridor could have supported, the site contains stemmed point tools that look nothing like Clovis, but bear a striking resemblance to projectile points found in Japan and coastal Northeast Asia. If people came overland through the interior, you wouldn't expect Japanese-style tools in Idaho. But if they came down the coast and then moved inland along river systems, Cooper's Ferry is exactly where you'd expect to find them. And here's the part that's genuinely haunting, and the real reason this story is so hard to nail down. When the Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, and the sea rose by hundreds of feet. The exact beaches those first Americans would have walked, the camps they built, the boats they may have launched, are now drowned, sitting under the waves offshore. That's why the coastal evidence is thin. Not because anyone hid it, because the ocean swallowed it. So strip away the fake news banners and the implied aliens on the cave wall, and you're left with something far more interesting than any conspiracy. There's no villain in this story, no secret memo, no buried report, no scientist sworn to silence. There's just evidence, footprints in gypsum, DNA in a cave, a corridor that opened too late, slowly forcing a comfortable old assumption to fall apart. That's not science failing, and it's not science lying. That's science doing the one thing the cover-up videos can't afford to admit it does, changing its mind when the ground shifts beneath it. The first Americans were here far earlier than we were ever taught. They almost certainly came by sea, and the best chapters of their story are probably still out there, waiting, under a few hundred feet of water that didn't exist when they made the crossing. So I'll leave you with a real question, not a bait one. Of everything we just walked through, which site convinces you the most? And where do you think the next proof is going to come from? The dirt or the sea floor? Let me know in the comments.